In a quiet town in Iowa in 1912, there stood a house on 2nd Street where, to this very day, locals whisper that if you step inside at midnight, the chill you feel doesn't come from the wind, but from the axe blade of a killer who was never caught. This isn't folklore or legend. This is the true story of 8 innocent lives brutally taken in one night. A mystery that has haunted America for over a century. If you want to follow this investigation and learn about other chilling true crime cases that still baffle investigators, make sure to subscribe to our channel, because the answers you seek might be hiding in the shadows of the past. The morning of June 10, 1912 began like any other in Villisca, Iowa, a quiet town of barely 2,000 people. But by day's end, what was discovered would haunt this community forever. This was a community where people knew their neighbors, where children played freely in the streets, and where front doors were rarely locked. The Moore family represented everything wholesome about small-town American life in the early 20th century. Josiah B. Moore, 43 years old, was a well-respected businessman in Villisca, working as a manager for the John Deere Implement Company. He was known throughout the community as a successful, ambitious man who had built a comfortable life for his family. His wife, Sarah Moore, age 39, was a devoted mother and active member of the Presbyterian Church. Together, they had 4 children: Herman Montgomery Moore, 11 years old, a bright boy who loved baseball and helping his father with chores; Mary Catherine Moore, 10, a sweet girl known for her kindness to other children; Arthur Boyd Moore, 7, full of energy and curiosity; and Paul Vernon Moore, 5, the baby of the family who still clung to his mother's skirts. The family lived in a modest 2-story home at 508 East 2nd Street, a white-painted house with a front porch that faced the quiet residential street. It had 6 rooms, a parlor, dining room, and kitchen on the 1st floor, and 3 bedrooms upstairs. There was also a small guest room downstairs where visitors occasionally stayed. The house had modern conveniences for its time, including electric lighting, which had only recently been installed in Villisca. The Moore children attended the local school, participated in church activities, and were well liked by their peers and teachers. On the evening of June 9, 1912, the Moore family attended the Children's Day program at the Presbyterian Church, a special event where local children performed for the congregation. It was a warm summer evening, and the church was filled with families from the community. The Moore children had been practicing for weeks. Catherine and her friend Lena Stillinger had a special part in the program. Lena Gertrude Stillinger, age 12, and her younger sister Ina May Stillinger, age 8, were daughters of Joseph and Sarah Stillinger, who lived nearby. The girls were close friends with the Moore children, especially Catherine. After the program concluded around 9:30 p.m., Catherine Moore asked her parents if Lena and Ina could spend the night at their house. Sarah Moore agreed, as it wasn't unusual for the girls to have sleepovers. The Stillinger parents gave their permission, expecting to see their daughters the next morning. At approximately 9:45 p.m., witnesses reported seeing the Moore family and the 2 Stillinger girls walking together down the street toward the Moore house. They appeared happy, still excited from the evening's performances. Several neighbors later recalled seeing them arrive home, the children's voices carrying in the quiet night air. This was the last time anyone saw any of them alive. What happened in the hours that followed remains one of the most disturbing mysteries in American criminal history. At some point between 10:00 p.m. on June 9 and 5:00 a.m. on June 10, someone entered the Moore house and committed an act of violence so savage, so methodical, that it would shock even the most hardened investigators of the era. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came at approximately 5:00 a.m. on June 10, 1912. Mary Peckham, a neighbor who lived next door to the Moores, was an early riser. She knew the routines of the Moore household well. Josiah was always up by dawn to tend to his horses before heading to work. The children would usually be stirring by 6:00 a.m., and Sarah would have the stove going to prepare breakfast. But that morning, an eerie silence hung over the Moore house. At 7:00 a.m., Mary Peckham's concern grew. There were no sounds of children playing, no smoke rising from the chimney, no signs of life whatsoever. She could hear the horses in the barn behind the house whinnying and stamping, clearly distressed and unfed. The chickens in the yard were making unusual amounts of noise. Most peculiar was that all the curtains and shades in the house were drawn tightly closed, unusual for a summer morning when most families would open their windows to catch the cool air before the day's heat set in. Mary walked to the Moore house and knocked on the door. There was no answer. She knocked again, louder this time, calling out for Sarah. Still nothing. The door was locked from the inside, growing increasingly worried. She returned to her own home and telephoned Ross Moore, Josiah's brother, who lived in the neighboring town. Ross Moore arrived at approximately 8:00 a.m. He too knocked and called out, but received no response. Using a spare key that Josiah had given him for emergencies, Ross unlocked the door and entered through the front entrance. He later described an overwhelming sense of dread as he stepped into the darkened house. All the blinds were pulled down, and the interior was dim despite the bright morning sun outside. What Ross Moore discovered in the downstairs guest bedroom would haunt him for the rest of his life. Lying on the bed were two small bodies, covered with blood-stained bedsheets. It was Lena and Ina Stillinger. Ross didn't need to check for signs of life. The amount of blood, the unnatural stillness, and the obvious head trauma made it clear that the girls were dead. He immediately fled the house and ran to the nearest telephone to call the town marshal. Hank Horton, the Villisca town marshal, arrived at the scene within minutes, accompanied by several townspeople who had heard Ross Moore's frantic calls for help. What they found inside 508 East 2nd Street was a scene of carnage that defied comprehension. In the downstairs guest room, where Ross had made his initial discovery, investigators found the bodies of 2-year-old Lena Stillinger and 8-year-old Ina Stillinger. Both girls were lying in the bed, positioned as if they had been sleeping. Their heads had been crushed by multiple blows. The bedding was soaked with blood. Eerily, someone had covered their faces with bedclothes, and a dress had been placed over the lower body of one of the girls in what investigators later theorized might have been a gesture of modesty or remorse. Upstairs, the horror multiplied. In the master bedroom, Josiah and Sarah Moore lay in their bed. Josiah had suffered the most brutal attack of all the victims. His head had been struck so many times that his facial features were nearly unrecognizable. The autopsy would later reveal that he had been struck more than 30 times. The weapon had been applied with such force that it had penetrated his skull, splitting it open. Brain matter and blood covered the bed, the walls, and even the ceiling above. Sarah Moore lay beside her husband, similarly battered, though her injuries, while fatal, were less extensive than Josiah's. In the children's bedroom, investigators found Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul Moore. All 4 children had been murdered in their beds. Like the others, they appeared to have been killed in their sleep. Each child had suffered multiple blows to the head. The youngest, 5-year-old Paul, was found in bed with his mother's body, suggesting Sarah may have grabbed him at some point during the night, perhaps seeking to protect him or find comfort, or he may have wandered to his parents' room before the attack occurred. The murder weapon was quickly identified. Leaning against the wall in the downstairs guest bedroom, the investigators found Josiah Moore's own axe. It was a heavy tool, the kind used for splitting wood, and it was covered in blood and hair. The killer had used the blunt side of the axe head for most of the murders, a detail that made the violence even more grotesque. Only Josiah Moore had been struck with the sharp blade of the axe, suggesting a particular rage directed at him. But the physical violence was only part of the disturbing crime scene. The killer had engaged in bizarre behavior that suggested either ritualistic tendencies or severe psychological disturbance. Every mirror in the house had been covered with cloth. Investigators found towels, clothing, and bed sheets draped over all reflective surfaces. The victims' faces had also been covered with bedclothes. This detail would become one of the most analyzed aspects of the case, with theories ranging from superstition about mirrors capturing souls to the killer's inability to face his own reflection or the faces of his victims. In the downstairs bedroom where the Stillinger girls lay, investigators discovered a piece of bacon, estimated to weigh about 2 pounds, wrapped in a towel and placed on the floor near the bed. This detail has never been satisfactorily explained. Some theorized it might have been intended as some form of offering or symbolic gesture, while others suggested the killer might have been eating and left it there. The killer had spent considerable time in the house after the murders. In the kitchen, investigators found evidence that someone had attempted to wash up. There was bloody water in a basin, and blood-stained towels near the sink. A kerosene lamp had been found in the kitchen, turned down but still warm, suggesting it had been used recently. The lamp had cigarette butts next to it, though none of the Moore family smoked. Most chilling was the evidence that the killer had prepared food for themselves. Investigators found a plate with crumbs and remnants of food that appeared to have been consumed after the murders. This suggested a level of calm and comfort in the house that was deeply disturbing. The killer had not fled in panic but had taken time to eat, wash, and prepare to leave without haste. All the doors had been locked from the inside. The killer had taken the keys when they left, exiting through the door and locking it behind them. This detail suggested premeditation and a cool head. The killer had also moved systematically through the house, suggesting familiarity with the layout. The state of the victims' bodies suggested they had been killed in their sleep. There were no signs of defensive wounds, no evidence of a struggle, no overturned furniture or disturbed household items beyond the bedrooms where the murders occurred. The killer had apparently moved from room to room, executing each victim before they could wake or react. The timeline suggested the murders likely occurred in the early morning hours, perhaps between midnight and 5:00 a.m. Investigators noted that someone would have needed to be intimately familiar with the house to move through it so effectively in near darkness. While the house had electric lights, they were not turned on, and the killer appeared to have navigated using either the moonlight or perhaps the kerosene lamp. This led to early theories that the killer might have hidden in the house before the family returned from church, waiting in the attic or a closet until everyone was asleep. The attic access was examined, and investigators found what they believed might be marks indicating someone had spent time there. There was also a theory that the killer had exited through an unlocked window in the attic after the murders, though this was never definitively proven. The investigation into the Villisca Axe Murders began immediately, but it was hampered from the start by catastrophic errors that would ensure the case remained unsolved. The first and most critical mistake occurred within hours of the bodies being discovered. Before law enforcement could properly secure the scene, news of the murders spread through the small town like wildfire. Curious townspeople, estimated at over 100 individuals, entered the house to view the crime scene. This was not uncommon in rural areas at the time, where such events were rare and drew intense public interest. But the result was devastating to the investigation. Footprints were trampled, potential evidence was moved or taken as morbid souvenirs, and the crime scene was irreparably contaminated. Fingerprint analysis was a relatively new forensic technique in 1912, and while some law enforcement agencies had begun to use it, the Villisca police had neither the training nor the equipment. Even if they had, the number of people who had touched surfaces in the house made any fingerprint evidence useless. The investigation was led by Villisca Town Marshal Hank Horton, assisted by County Sheriff Jack Jackson, and later by private detectives hired by concerned citizens and the state. In an era before standardized police procedures, crime scene photography, or modern forensic techniques, investigators relied primarily on witness statements, physical evidence that could be observed with the naked eye, and interrogation of suspects. Several individuals immediately came under suspicion. The first was a man named Frank F. Jones, a prominent Villisca businessman and Iowa state senator. Jones had previously employed Josiah Moore, but the two had a bitter falling out in 1908 when Moore left Jones's company to work for a competitor. The relationship between the two men had remained acrimonious, and there was local gossip about ongoing business disputes. Some theories suggested Jones might have hired someone to kill Moore, with the other victims being collateral damage to cover the true motive. Suspicion also fell on William Mansfield, an itinerant preacher who had been in Villisca on the night of the murders. Mansfield had attended the Children's Day program at the church and had been seen by multiple witnesses. His behavior was described as odd by some townspeople. Mansfield left town early on the morning of June 10, before the bodies were discovered. When investigators learned of his hasty departure, they tracked him down for questioning. Mansfield initially denied any involvement, but his story contained inconsistencies. He claimed to have left Villisca on an early morning train, but railroad records didn't fully corroborate his timeline. However, investigators could not place him at the Moore house, and there was no physical evidence connecting him to the crime. Mansfield would be investigated, released, and later investigated again multiple times over the years. Another suspect emerged when investigators learned about the existence of a transient who had been seen in the area, Henry Lee Moore, later known as the Man from the Train, was a serial killer who confessed to multiple axe murders across the Midwest during the same time period. His method matched the Villisca killings in several ways. Entire families killed with an axe while sleeping, usually the family's own axe, and evidence of the killer spending time in the house afterward. However, Henry Lee Moore was never definitively linked to the Villisca case, and some details didn't match his known pattern. The most controversial suspect was Reverend George Kelly, an English-born traveling minister who had also attended the Children's Day program. Kelly had a history of mental instability and had made several concerning statements about the murders in the weeks and months following them. He allegedly told people that he had visions or dreams about the killings, and his behavior became increasingly erratic. In 1917, 5 years after the murders, George Kelly was arrested and charged with the murders. His trial became a sensation. The prosecution's case relied heavily on alleged confessions Kelly had made, though Kelly's defenders argued these were the ramblings of a mentally ill man, not genuine admissions of guilt. There was no physical evidence linking Kelly to the crime scene. No witnesses could place him at the Moore house on the night in question. The timeline of his movements was unclear. The first trial ended with a hung jury in September 1917. Kelly was tried again in November 1917, and this time he was acquitted. The jury found the evidence insufficient to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Kelly was the killer. Kelly was released, and he lived until 1933, always maintaining his innocence despite his earlier confusing statements. Over the decades, investigators and amateur sleuths have proposed numerous other theories. Some suggested the killer was someone with a personal grudge against Josiah Moore, making the murders of his family and the Stillinger girls necessary to eliminate witnesses. Others theorized the killer had a sexual motive, particularly given the attack on the young girls, though there was no evidence of sexual assault found during the examinations. The covered mirrors led some to speculate about a killer with deep, superstitious beliefs or mental illness that created paranoia about reflective surfaces. The piece of bacon remains unexplained by any coherent theory. The fact that the killer locked the doors and took the keys suggested premeditation and a calm, organized mind. Yet the savage brutality of the attacks suggested rage and loss of control. Despite extensive investigation by local law enforcement, state authorities, and private detectives hired by the community, no one was ever convicted of the Villisca Axe Murders. The case officially became a cold case, one of the oldest unsolved mass murders in American history. In the decades since, it has been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and investigations by both professional law enforcement and amateur researchers using modern technology and forensic techniques. The house at 508 East 2nd Street still stands today. It has been restored to appear much as it did in 1912 and operates as a museum and, controversially, as a destination for paranormal investigators. Visitors can tour the house during the day or even stay overnight, sleeping in the same rooms where the murders occurred. Many visitors and paranormal investigators have reported strange experiences, unexplained sounds, objects moving, the feeling of being watched, and electronic voice phenomena that some interpret as the voices of the victims or perhaps the killer. In 2014, an incident occurred when a visitor to the house, who was staying overnight as part of a paranormal investigation, allegedly stabbed themselves in the chest. The individual survived and later stated they had been overcome by a malevolent presence in the house. This incident led to increased scrutiny of the overnight stays and debates about whether it was appropriate to turn a murder site into a tourist attraction. The Villisca Axe Murders represent more than just an unsolved crime. They are a window into early 20th century America, into small-town life, into the limitations of law enforcement of that era, and into the public's fascination with violent crime. The case has been examined through the lens of criminology, psychology, sociology, and even paranormal studies. The tragedy devastated the small community of Villisca. The Moore family was buried together in a plot at the Villisca Cemetery. The Stillinger girls were buried in separate plots. The funerals drew hundreds of mourners. The psychological impact on the town was profound and lasting. Parents became fearful. Doors that had never been locked were suddenly bolted tight, and the sense of safety that had defined rural Iowa life was shattered. For the families of the victims, there was never closure. Joseph and Sarah Stillinger lost both of their daughters in one night. The extended Moore family lost a brother, a sister-in-law, a nephew, and 3 nieces. They lived the rest of their lives knowing that the person who had taken their loved ones had never been brought to justice, had never answered for the crime, and might have lived out their days as a free person, perhaps even as a respected member of another community. The investigation itself highlighted the importance of proper crime scene management, the value of forensic evidence, and the need for trained investigators. In many ways, the failures at Villisca helped shape modern criminal investigation techniques. The contamination of the crime scene became a cautionary tale taught to generations of law enforcement officers. More than 110 years have passed since that terrible night in June 1912. The case remains officially unsolved. No one knows with certainty who killed Josiah Moore, Sarah Moore, Herman Moore, Catherine Moore, Boyd Moore, Paul Moore, Lena Stillinger, and Ina Stillinger. Theories abound, but facts are scarce. The killer, whoever they were, took their secret to the grave, or perhaps lived with it, hidden, for decades. The Villisca Axe Murders stand as a stark reminder that not all crimes are solved, and not all families receive the justice they deserve. This case transformed how law enforcement approaches crime scenes and underscored the devastating impact one night of violence can have on an entire community for generations. Could modern forensic technology finally solve this century-old mystery? Was one of the suspects truly guilty? Or did the real killer slip away into anonymity? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And remember to keep the discussion respectful and fact-based. If you want to explore more unsolved cases and the evolution of criminal justice, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Behind every case file are real people whose memories deserve to be honored with truth and dignity. Thank you for watching.